We are up and running. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. We are talking about Beyond the Battlefield, connecting the public with history. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and I am so happy to be joined by two people who put up with me far too often. I'm joined this evening by Dr. Ashley Luskey of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. I'm also joined by Ranger Steve Phan, Civil War Defenses of Washington. Good evening, guys. How are we all doing?
Hi there. Good to see you both.
Yeah, it's good to see everyone. It's good to be on, and hey, let's have a good time.
Yeah, we got a lot to talk about this evening, and a lot of people have been talking about what we're doing. And Steve, you've been doing some videos to let everyone know what we're going to be doing tonight. And I think it's a very important topic to discuss because I've been doing so many things with Civil War things that once in a while we need to think about what else we can talk about with it. And this is one of those occasions. So Steve, you actually were one who came up with the idea, right, of doing this?
Yeah, I remember just kind of sending you a message, I think a couple weeks ago, kind of figuring out topics, since I think every historical organization in the world was doing Zoom videos. So I'm like, yeah. I think we should jump in on this. And, I think we're just kind of thinking about topics kind of inside the box and outside the box as well. And I don't want to give him any credit for this, but I guess we have to talk about Dr. Pete Carmichael. And I remember meeting him for the first time in 2012. I did the Gettysburg semester program, as Ashley did before me. And I got to know Pete towards the end of the semester, and we got close very quickly. And I just remember him saying something to me, moving on actually in 2013, which is another Ashley connection as well, which is such a crazy world. But he's the one that was got me connected to Richmond National Battlefield Park. So I interned there in the summer of 2013. And I remember having a phone conversation with him before I went out there. And he's like, is the Civil War your end destination? I'm like, I think it is. And he's like, well, you're gonna have to leave beloved Colorado. And by the way, the further you get into this, or the deeper you get into this, excuse me, the further you're gonna get away from the battlefield. And I was just, oh, never. And you when you first get into the Civil War, you're so caught up in tactics and movements of armies and flanking maneuvers and stuff like that. Where was the artillery placed? But he was absolutely right about that, right? And so the deeper I've delved into Civil War history, in many ways, the further I've gotten away from the kind of the military interpretation traditionally that a lot of people know of the Civil War. So that's kind of what inspired this program. And I couldn't think of a better person to be a part of this than Ashley Luskey. I got to work with her in Richmond. She was one of my mentors, and just kind of seeing the work she did down there. It was inspiring, and it was kind of a different way of looking at the Civil War through kind of viewing. She was in Richmond, and I kind of thought about the same thing when I've done Washington, D.C., right? There's a lot of different layers of history here. So kind of let's dive in and kind of reveal it to people. And that's kind of where we're at now.
Mm-hmm. So Ashley, what was it like being his mentor?
Oh, gosh.
I got to know.
It was a thrill a minute.
There we go.
It was an adventure. No, we had a really a good time. I think we had an enriching time. There were some very slow days out at Cold Harbor. I remember when Steve and I got to chew the fat, so to speak, where we talked about everything, a lot of the times it being historical content about Steve's passion for the Civil War, where it came from, kind of where he was headed with his personal research. And that's when I think we also started talking a bit about some methodologies, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
And how you and I had approached Civil War history when talking with the public about some topics of interest. And I knew very much at that time that you were very committed to the military story, which I definitely, I have a very soft spot in my heart for it myself. But I think we also talked about ways to expand that conversation, not get away from military history at all, because you can't avoid it. You have to talk about it, especially when you're out on the battlefield, but ways to enhance it, to broaden it, to connect it to cultural history, to political history, to what's happening on the home front, to talk about social history, to talk about people who might not have been present at all on the battlefield. but whose identities, whose interactions with soldiers before battles, before the war, certainly shaped the worldviews of those soldiers and how they internalized their experiences or represented them to others. And of course, I liked to do a lot of programs in Richmond about civilian experiences, about women's experiences. There's even one, a tour of Richmond's Civil War red light district that always got some good laughs, and interestingly, some new faces would show up on that tour that had not been yet seen on the battlefield. So that was kind of a way to draw people in to the military story and to the battlefields. People who never would want to set foot on a battlefield, they would attend some of those tours saying, well, I'm more interested in hearing about the women, or I'm more interested in hearing about, you know, daily social life in Richmond and the political dynamics of the city. And then they'd realize, hey, you can't really understand this story without also visiting the battlefields and talking about where the husbands and sons and brothers of some of these people were, and how there was this constant interplay between the battlefield and the home front that you really couldn't separate. So I think some of our historically grounded conversations along those lines were pretty fruitful. And I hope that Steve took something away from them that was productive. I think he did.
Yeah, I knew that you were still, Ashley, I knew you were still into the Richmond stuff because you did a talk on the bread rides, and I threatened to be there with Steve and throw breadcrumbs at you or something.
That's right. That's right.
Like, oh, there's a civilian experience right there.
I've gotten that threat numerous times before. I remember actually one tour that Steve helped me out on that was really enjoyable. And Steve, I'm curious to hear kind of your, you know, input looking back on it now that you've done a lot more interpretation along these lines. A tour of Fort Gilmer, which was part of the larger defenses surrounding Richmond. The Battle of Fort Gilmer happened in September of 1864 as part of the larger Petersburg campaign. And a central part of that story was the role of United States colored troops, the role that they played in the battle and how Confederates responded to them. And then what happened to some of those who were taken prisoner after the battle, and looking at how Union and Confederate soldiers after the battle both represented that experience, particularly the very unique aspect of fighting with the United States colored troops, ironically in defenses that were largely built by African-American laborers, slaves from Richmond. So that was a perfect way to connect the site history, the here and now. We're standing on this ground. Literally, these defenses were in large part dug by African-American slaves, and then they're turning around and they were being attacked. Confederates were using them to defend themselves. USCTs were attacking Confederates. There were episodes of Confederates lighting cannonballs and rolling them over the top of the defenses into the trenches from the parapet, and basically using them as, you know, grenades against United States colored troops. And so just the deep ironies there, the cultural history, the social political history, it was a perfect way to connect both sides. But I remember that one being particularly enjoyable to do with Steve's help.
Yeah, I remember that really well. It was when your in-laws were in town. You remember
That's
that?
right.
Yeah, that was fun. I mean, yeah, I've actually kind of drawn some parallels with that because obviously I work with the defenses of Washington, right? And the interesting thing, and I'll say this to you as well, John, one of the reasons why I really expanded the kind of narrative and the interpretation of the Civil War sites in DC is because I have to, you know, like I'm just being practical. We've got 2 days of action with the Battle of Fort Stevens, which I love, but there's only so much we can do with that, right? I mean, it's a cool action. There was a lot of interesting characters there, of course, with Abraham Lincoln under fire and things like that. But the defenses were around for over 4 years, and there was so much that transpired at these sites. And kind of like what Ashley was talking about, you know, the defenses of Washington originally built by Union soldiers, white Union soldiers that formed the nucleus of the Army of Potomac. But when they left to go to Richmond or try to get to Richmond during the Peninsula campaign in 1862, it left a void of work, you know. So they started relying on not only like free white labor, paid labor, but also in growing numbers, formerly enslaved African Americans. And so I started reading articles and reports saying that an estimated 40 to 50,000 former enslaved people came into the city during the Civil War. I'm like, wow, that's a huge number, first of all. And then I thought, well, the city is completely surrounded by fortifications. They have to get through the forts. So I started diving into the records of the regimental histories of the units that were there, and the stories and the accounts they have are absolutely incredible. So you have the interaction on the ground between soldiers and former slaves escaping slavery, and kind of the breakdown of slavery on the ground with the Union Army. And it's different depending on where you're at in the defenses. If you're in Virginia, where Virginia is in rebellion against the United States, they're openly taking in former slaves, right? But in Maryland, which is a border state still in the Union, you know, the federal laws are still in place, including the Fugitive Slave Act. They're allowing slave owners to come into federal camps to retrieve their property. So I remember actually talking to Ashley's husband, Brian, about that. He's like, you should read this account about this so-and-so camp. It's actually really close to Fort Stevens where this happened at. And the soldiers themselves were the ones that made the decision that they're staying with us. And so you should have seen the conflict between the slave owners and the soldiers themselves. So really the breakdown happens there. And so that's been really kind of been inspiring me to go forward with this research, right? This idea, like, you kind of start with Fort Stevens and the battle that took place for 2 days within the confines of DC. But once you kind of span out, you understand there's a lot more that happened here. And Pete Carmichael would be so proud of me that it's kind of headed this way, right? But I mean, I can tell you whatever you want about the Battle of Fort Stevens, but I'm completely kind of away from that now, right? We have 4 years of history that we're really diving into, and afterward as well. And African Americans use these sites as the foundation of new communities, right? At Fort Reno, they built this community called Reno City, and it was formerly enslaved people that built this segregated community after the Civil War, which goes into the early 1900s. And then they're literally pushed out, their houses are plowed over, and they build a park there, right? So these are type of the stories and heartbreaking at times that we need to talk about. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm wondering, when you were doing that red light district tour, don't worry, this question isn't going to get weird. Did you see a different, not only different group of people, but were the demographics vastly different on a tour like that, instead of just like a battlefield tour or something? Did you see
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Sure. Yes and no. Richmond was fortunate to have back then, and it still has a loyal cadre of followers who come out to any and all programs, which is always great to see. So we did see a lot of familiar faces, but we did see some new faces. We saw a lot of women who came out because I think a lot of people think, oh, the Homefront story, that's a woman's story. Mm-hmm. Which again, yes and no. I sometimes have problems with that when people think, oh, when we talk about gender, we're only talking about women. Of course, that's not true. Gender refers to masculinity just as much as it does to femininity and the interplay between the two. But, you know, I think that the social history aspect, when you're talking about prostitutes and elite women and female treasury clerks, you're going to get a certain different demographic that's interested in that, you know, saw the battlefield as a place that, not very interesting. It's basically what Steve said. It's flanking maneuvers. It's this regiment moved here at this time in the afternoon, et cetera, et cetera. So we did see more women. We did have a few people of color, a few African Americans, if I recall correctly, especially as we got later into the Civil War sesquicentennial and did some more diverse programming. We saw kind of the diversity tick up in those categories as well. But I do have to say, I think what is exciting is that some of those loyal people that had come out to every single battlefield tour and battlefield anniversary, anything that we did on the battlefield, they were there for the home front tours. And I think that was one of those instances where it went to show that sometimes we don't give our public enough credit. I think sometimes we put people into boxes and we think, oh, well, the only people who will come to this tour are going to be white men, older white men. And that's not true. I think that demographics are changing in terms of who's interested in what. I think people are seeing more of the crossover between the home front and the battlefield. They're seeing that going on a standard battlefield tour these days is not the same as it was even 10, 15 years ago. The stories are broader, they're deeper, they connect to larger aspects of the human experience where I think most people can find at least a nugget of something that they can relate to or find interest in. And then, as I said, earlier, some of those new faces who I thought, I don't know if they'll come out to the anniversary of the Cold Harbor battle on June 3rd. They were there and they said, we got really interested and we do want to know these stories, and we want to know how, the devastation on the home front, the hysteria caused by the bread riots, how did that impact, morale on the battlefield? Did men feel emasculated by what was happening on the home front? Did they kind of lose hope? Did they give up the ghost? They wanted to know how, reactions of soldiers on the battlefield to death and suffering may have been different from what they had been told on these tours about, life in some of the harder to live in sections of Richmond during the war. And they wanted to make those comparisons. So I was really impressed with what the public could handle and wanted to handle. And it gave me a lot of excitement and hope, thinking that, yes, sometimes we do underestimate the public, but in fact, they're prepared for and they're hungry for far more than we might originally think.
Mm-hmm. I've found through living history presentations and also just doing interpretive things wherever it may be that I never take in. It's like when you see something on the news, I never take in the first reports. I take them with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's that initial blowback about why are we talking about this? Why are we even discussing this? This isn't what's going on here. Because I remember when they built the new visitor center in Gettysburg, there was blowback about why are we talking about slavery? And it's like, well, there's a reason why we're talking about this. And that initial blowback lasted maybe a year or 6 months, and then it went away. I've found that with some interpretive programs where I'll put something on or I'll talk about something, and there's that initial kind of, we don't want to talk about it, or we're kind of like, why are we talking about this? And it takes a little while, but then you come around to it where it's like, okay, now it's starting to make sense in a way. And maybe that's what Pete was trying to describe to you, Steve, as well, is in a roundabout way, that we're all kind of, a lot of us start out as like these people who are talking about what Reynolds did on July 1st, moving
He did a lot.
He was the best. He was the best.
Indeed.
And, the movements and such of any unit on the field. But then we dive deeper into why are they even here, and
right.
what's going on in the letters they're reading, et cetera. I think a lot of us start out that way.
Yeah, I think interesting, I did my first internship with the Park Service at Gettysburg with Greg Goodell in Special Collections. And then I went and worked with Bert Ashley, Mike Gorman, all those people down at Richmond in 2013. Kind of took a couple year hiatus, and I came back and I was in grad school and I was at Stones River National Battlefield, so kind of these rural type battlefields, right? Certain sections of it. So when I went to work in DC at the Defense of Washington, I was a bit nervous. I was kind of uncertain if I could do, this type of history in an urban setting. And then I realized that it's an incredible setting. There's so many different opportunities. I describe it as a blank canvas in many ways, right? Because there is so much history just spread throughout the region here. And I think actually you make a great point about this, John. You were just talking about this. I think at times we underestimate the audience. And so the people that have been coming to the programs, which has really increased over the past 3 years, I'm very proud of that. They tell me after the programs, they're like, just keep on doing this and we're going to keep on coming out, right? And the stories and the narratives change, whether we're talking about construction of fortifications or we're talking about people that lived around them, or the people that are coming into the city, or what's going on in the city, right? And so, for example, the National Park Service manages so many of those circles around Washington, D.C. that has these Civil War monuments at, right? And so I'm thinking, he says, hey, let's do a program there. And, just doing simple research, you just find out like, wow, there's a lot that happened here, right? So one of my most successful programs was at Logan Circle. General John A. Logan was there from the Union Army of the Tennessee, and Democratic a politician that was very instrumental in the war effort and then and afterward as well. And so I just did research. His house is actually still on the square there, and find out that there was a cavalry camp there, Union cavalry camp, which became a contraband camp for refugees of slavery. And the conditions there were so bad and so many people were dying of disease and illness that they created contraband hospital right in that same area. It's like, wow, this is a program, right? We could really do something here. And it was a sunset program as well a couple of years ago had almost 100 people there. A very diverse audience. People came from all over the place. They loved the program. And we walked from there up north to where Contraband Hospital was at. And then we walked to the African American Civil War Memorial, which is managed by the Park Service. Right across the street is the African American Civil War Museum. So we're making all these different connections, right? And then very practically, U Street Metro Station was there. So when the program was over, everyone jumped on the Metro and everyone went home, right? Yeah. So that's kind of why I describe as there's just so many layers of history here. Obviously in DC, the landscape is changing almost every day, right? New buildings going up here and there, new condos, things like that. But if you just look at the street name or the name of the neighborhood, oh my gosh, there's a lot here that we can work with. And it's been a joy, to be honest with you. I look forward to doing more and more.
Yeah, there's so much going on right now where it's not just a generational thing anymore. It's being a generalization thing, or generation thing. We had that in the 1970s with it going deeper into social history and women's studies, gender studies, et cetera, with the Civil War. Right. And now it's diving even deeper and deeper into meanings of historical memory. And that is another tour, especially with statues and stuff like that. It's just amazing to see where we're going with the environmental history and all this.
Well, John, I'll say real quick, I know Ashley was talking about the Fort Gilmore program that I helped be a part of, which I find ironic because I was kind of hanging out in the back doing the intern thing. And now I have my interns doing the same thing as well. Like, oh my gosh, it comes full circle, right?
Tables have turned.
Right. The program that I still think about, Ashley, was the one that we did at Tredegar, that evening program that you had all of us read those quotes from. That was incredible. I mean, I know that took weeks and weeks of research. Can you describe that to the viewers and to John, please? That was one of my favorite programs.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So that was a lot of fun to work on because it was so different from what we usually were doing with outdoor interpretation in the park. So this was a program somewhat modeled off of what John Hennessy was doing up in Fredericksburg at the time during the sesquicentennial, called Voices from the Storm. And I believe we did this for 2 different summers. So we did 2012 as well as
2013.
I think 2013.
Yeah, that's when I was there. Yep.
Or maybe it was 2013, 2014. But basically what it was I generated a script based off of different research into primary source documents, into newspapers, into memoirs, to try and give some texture to what the daily life in and around Richmond was like during that particular year, 150 years before, that year. And so there was kind of an overall narrator who would kind of set the scene for this is what was going on, running you through, 63, for instance, or 2013, the year beginning with a terrible outbreak of smallpox in the city, with inflation, with things not looking so good for the Confederacy. Then, the bread riots occur in April 2nd of that year, and bringing in voices from that and all these different perspectives that showed how very different that event was experienced and lived and ultimately represented by the people who were in Richmond at that time. Soldiers responding to the event, elite women responding to the event, either trying to, write the participants out of history, saying, they weren't real Southerners, they were foreigners. Mississippi wharf rats was one of my favorite descriptions of the participants. And then there were some quotes as well from kind of middling to lower middling class women who maybe had a little bit of empathy for what the women were going through. Some quotes from officers on the front lines who heard about what was going on and were horrified. From newspaper editors who used very specific gendered language again to describe the women who took part in those bread riots. Often denying them their femininity and using very military martial terms to describe them, talking about them marching through the city in platoons. Amazon-looking viragos is another term they use to describe them. All sorts of interesting stuff. So that was just one particular incident within the script. But then we walked through, the various battles that occurred not just, in the Richmond area, because 63 didn't see a heck of a lot compared to 62 and 64, but also how Richmonders heard about the big battles occurring. Of course, Gettysburg, of course, Chancellorsville, Chickamauga later in the year, and how, again, they're kind of channeling that information and making sense of it. And so it was kind of this cacophony of voices that came together. And we had a series of, I don't want to call you all actors necessarily. You were reading scripts, and some of you, chose to read them a little bit more dramatically. But you were all portraying certain characters, so to speak, just to give the audience an idea of some of those different perspectives, and just how rich that history and that historical record are when it comes to trying to unpack those complex events, but also trying to give texture and meat and layers to what life was like in Richmond. So again, that was trying to connect very strongly the battlefields with the home front, the military, social, political scene with what's going on in the battlefield, and how the two, deeply intertwined with each other. It was a neat program.
Still one of my favorites, Ashley. So obviously I remember it very well.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. And, John, I go back to something that you had mentioned a little bit earlier about, the 70s, 1970s being a turning point for the new social history, so to speak, and incorporating more of women's voices, talking about African-American history. I think sometimes maybe starting with the media, but also going with other people, they don't give public history and the Park Service and other public history sites enough credit for how far interpretation has come. I think sometimes, they cherry pick these incidents, which will always be there. I've experienced them myself, where a kind of hostile public will come and they'll say, I don't want to hear about Black history. I don't want to hear about slavery. I don't want to hear about women. I want to hear about the important stuff. Of course, those people are out there. They'll always be out there. But by and large, there's been a massive shift in the stories being told at most Civil War sites. And I think that trend is only continuing. And I think the trend of public engagement in those broader stories is only continuing. So I think we'd be remiss sometimes to kind of hang our heads in shame and say, oh, we haven't made any progress since the 70s. And, oh, these stories are still being scoffed at by and large. When in fact, as Steve has shown us so many times through the work that he's doing at the Defenses of Washington and so many other people at other parks, John Hennessy at Fredericksburg, Chris Gwynn at Gettysburg, so many people are making huge strides, and should, receive some credit for that.
Do you believe that this changing, I don't want to say changing narrative because it's a narrative of its own, we're not changing anything. We're just saying it in different ways and pointing things out. Do you think this is basically because of the field becoming more diverse than it used to be back in the day? Some people today are getting more recognition for actually being historians that they are than they would have years ago. Do you think that change is kind of like hand in hand?
I think yes and no. I think definitely, when you're thinking of female historians, women historians have become far more included in the fold since the 1970s. And so we have seen a rise in scholarship on women because a lot of women like to write about women and research about women. Same with African Americans, African American history. But again, I hate to peg people into historical niches based on their own identity, because as Steve has, again shown, you can be any gender, any race, and do whatever gender or whatever race's history very, very well. That's not to say that you might be missing something that a person from that particular identity might be able to bring forward. But I don't think you have to be a woman to do women's history. I don't think you have to be African American to do good history about slavery and African American history. And we've seen that time and again, historians who don't necessarily fit the mold, fit the identity of the subject that they're looking at are doing really, really great history. On the other hand, of course, there are really amazing historians whose own identities, very much align with some of the characters or some of the historical subjects that they're researching. So I would say yes and no, John, to that. And Steve, I'm curious to see kind of what you've felt through your research.
I think you're spot on, Ashley. There's not too much I can add to that. I think I hate bringing up that Carmichael guy. My goodness, but I think
His years must be ringing.
and this is a shout out to Dr. Jill Titus as well. And I remember remarking with her about this. I think it was October actually when we were there to interview the interns for the Pohanka Scholarship at So the Pohanka Scholarship, for all those that are listening, is inspired by Brian Pohanka, the Civil War historian and reenactor that was prominent and very close to a lot of our colleagues in the National Park Service, who unfortunately passed away in the 2000s. And so they fund internships for college students to go and work at Civil War battlefields. Many of them are national parks. And so last year was or 2 years ago was the first time I got to be part of the interviews. And then coming back this last fall, that was a huge moment for me, because even over a span of a year, you could see how much the students had grown. Absolutely incredible, right? And it makes sense. You're a first year student or a second year student, and you kind of have this you're at you go to Gettysburg College, and the battlefield's omnipresent. So you're going to have a skewed view of the Civil War. And those are kind of the answers we get in many cases. But I'm proud to say, and I know my colleagues in the Park Service would be happy to say as well, spending a summer, even 3 months working at a national park site, doing public history, speaking to the public daily, developing programs and doing research has been a huge learning experience for them, right? So, I mean, I was so joyful last year just to be around these students that I find these students inspire me, because I think we've all been there before. But when I see people like Cameron Sowers, I've seen him grow up incredibly over the span of the last 2 years or so. And, you're like, man, you see yourself in that student as well, right? And you kind of see the journey that he or she is going through. I know the college and the program has produced so many great public historians for the Park Service and beyond. And you can tell when they get into as the deeper they dive, naturally they start, expanding the narrative of the Civil War in many ways, or kind of the way they view it. So when I ask a lot of these students kind of what they're researching, and they tell me, something like super complex, I was like, wow, man, I wasn't doing that when I was your age. I mean, my senior thesis was about John Reynolds and his memory, so, which I'm still very proud of course. But
obviously,
I think Ashley is right. I like her kind of description of, we don't want to peg people in certain holes, right? And so I think the field is diversifying in a sense. I think the audience is. I mean, in many cases, it should. And I see that a lot in Washington D.C. because we've got a very diverse population that lives in and around Washington D.C. I'll give you guys I don't want to have this answer go on for too long, but I was given a program, Fort Bunker Hill, in Northeast Washington D.C., and just a regular, Civil War earthwork. The majority of the fort is gone. It's an urban park now. This was right before the government shut down last year. So gave a program in December of 2018. It was a great turnout, by the way, too. We had about 60, 70 people there, mostly from what they call the Brooklyn neighborhood. And one of the most compelling parts of the program, I'm sure you guys this will hit your heart. There was a gentleman on the program, African-American. He said, I've been living in this neighborhood my entire life. I remember coming to Fort Bunker Hill when they had segregated summer camps for kids. And all of us were like, wow, right? And so it kind of, that obviously hit a lot of us hard. All of us kind of took a step back, and then it also makes you think, there was a Civil War site here, but there was also a park that was around much longer than the fort was, and how did these people in the neighborhood experience these parks, right? I think actually you're seeing that a lot as well, as parks are really talking about how communities are basically invited to these spaces or feel comfortable coming out to these spaces, right? I guess in many cases they weren't even allowed to. So I think that's kind of the big next step in regards to kind of what we're doing in the Park Service with historic sites. But kind of in general, I see a lot of diverse audience coming in because the staff is diverse and the stories are diverse. That's a good thing.
Yeah, and that what that gentleman brought up when he came out there, that leads to an oral history project, that leads to another exhibit project.
Exactly.
And that's the way that we think, right? We're like, wow, okay, this is interesting. We'll get an intern on that. And
Exactly.
just here's your summer project.
Exactly.
Get as many of these oral histories together as you can, and we're gonna make an exhibit. And then it's not military, it's something else. It's, something else.
John, I don't want to steal the thunder because you are the incredible host. But one of the things I wanted to talk to Ashley about, because she's got a bunch of students working under her. And I wanted to ask her, when she has these students that come to Gettysburg, a lot of them are really geared onto the military aspects, the command and control. What's your approach to your students here, Ashley? I'm kind of interested, especially because you've got a PhD in history and you focus on public history, and you've worked as a public historian, but you're also an academic. I'm kind of interested to see how you do that.
Sure. Well, I never want to kill that passion, that initial passion that brought them to the college and to their study of history and the Civil War. I think it's admirable that they have that passion. To me, it's kind of like, okay, how can we, again, to use a Peter Carmichael term, get some altitude on the story,
yes.
To provide some greater context here. Let's pull back a little bit from the nuts and bolts of the battle narrative. And let's try and give some, humanity to these guys. Let's try and figure out, where did they come from? What were their community circumstances like? Why did they enlist? Or, if they were conscripted, how did that impact their family? I want to know what were their experiences like before they, arrived at X, Y, and Z battlefield, because these battles, of course, don't happen in a vacuum. Soldiers bring kind of the extra luggage, the baggage with them of previous battles that they've been fighting in or previous marches. I want to know the dynamics of these soldiers between them and their officers. I want to know how they responded to death, and their representations of death and perceptions of death evolved over the course of the war as the death toll, stacks up and up and up. I want to know what's happening with their families at home. I want to know how their relationship with their loved ones is shaping how they experience war, their thoughts on the war, how they endure the war, how they decide, I can't endure it anymore and I'm going to desert. I want to know, of course, the other end of the story. If they die in the battlefield, how do their families make sense of their death? How do communities come together and respond when a soldier is lost from the community and the widow or the struggling and aging mother and father are left alone to care for themselves at home? I want to know how the family memorializes them, how their comrades memorialize them, how veterans then turn and memorialize them either individually or collectively. And so one of the most exciting projects for me that I've worked on with some of these students is our Killed at Gettysburg digital project.
I was just going to ask you about that. I forgot the name, but yeah, I think people would be really interested in hearing about this.
Yeah, so that builds upon, I think, what a lot of students bring with them to the college, which is that passion for the Battle of Gettysburg, whether they've seen the movie 5 million times and they're quoting it in the Appleford, the Civil War theme house at night on Friday nights and Saturday nights while they watch their popcorn, or whatever drew them to Gettysburg in the first place. It builds upon it because it asks these students to research a soldier, any soldier. It could be someone that they might have read about in a history book. It can't be one of the big names like, Armistead or Reynolds. Sorry, Steve. But it can be, a junior officer. And it asks them to take that soldier and basically flesh out his story. It looks at that soldier in 3 parts. Number 1, the community, the reasons for enlisting. Where did they come from? What was that soldier's experience like before they came to Gettysburg? The second part is, what was Gettysburg like for that soldier? Where did they fight? What was the broader context of where their regiment was? That's kind of the nuts and bolts, military component of the narrative. And that also includes a GIS component, a mapping component called Story Map, where the students plot kind of the relative final footsteps of that soldier across the battlefield, using GIS plotting and taking images of the battlefield to kind of walk a virtual visitor through that soldier's final steps. And then the third chapter component to this is the memorialization section. So what was the impact of that soldier's death? upon the community back at home, upon their loved ones, upon veterans who are left behind, both in the moment and then years later when these veterans come back and dot the battlefield and make it into a memorial landscape. And so the whole point of this is, of course, to take one soldier, kind of a microcosm, I would say, of the Civil War, to look at him, and you can, of course, peg him to a very specific square of the battlefield, if you will, of where he fought. It's very site-specific history, but it brings in all of these different questions. It brings you away from Gettysburg. It brings you to South Carolina and to Maine and Vermont and Mississippi and all over the place in between to try and understand the larger context of that soldier's experience. And I think one of the great takeaways for students, or two of the great takeaways, is number one, they struggle to find, who was the average soldier? Do we have a quote unquote common soldier or a representative soldier? And to that question, no, there was no average common soldier. However, they do see trends, and part of the experience for them is workshopping their drafts back and forth. They workshop it with their peers, they workshop it with me. We start out by reading some historiography, some relevant, I know, the dreaded H word.
Yeah.
I know.
I need a beeper on here, beep that out.
Well, hey, let me add real quick. I've heard, because the students talk to me because I'm the cool ranger, right? That Dr. Luskey's not the easiest grader, so I'm just gonna throw that out there. Okay?
Well, to be fair, I don't grade them for this. This is all their work study students, or we even have some first year students who volunteer to go through the so-called misery of a Dr. Luskey red pen slashing.
That's right. Yes.
And they've been wonderful. But it's really a growth process for them to get their feet wet in the historiography, to connect these individual stories, the battle narrative, one piece of the concrete landscape with bigger ideas, with ideas of suffering and death, with ideas about the emotional connections that soldiers forge with each other, the negotiations they had with junior officers and senior officers, all of those dynamics, looking at issues of gender and honor and cowardice. And each profile kind of takes its own turn. Some are focused on kind of medical stories. Some tend to focus on immigrant stories. Some are about, the plight of brothers or of an individual soldier coming from an impoverished family and what that means for the community back at home when that soldier does not return. And so that's one takeaway for the students is, no, there is no common soldier. Each one is different. However, there are trends that we can latch onto and connect to and make sense out of. The second one is, I think it provides a bit of historical humility, if you will, in that I think they finally realize that they don't have the final say on that soldier. They don't know everything. They can only know so much from a semester or two worth of research. We take them down to the National Archives when we can to find compiled service records and widow's pension records for the soldier. But other than that, they have to do most of their research here in Gettysburg at the Park Archives, stuff they can find online through Fold 3. And they come out of it with questions, was he really killed on July 3rd, or did he linger for months, as one note in his compiled service record said? Did his widow remarry, as one document said, or did she never remarry and she ended up having to force herself into, domestic servitude to keep alive? And it teaches humility. It teaches them that doing history is hard work. It's going to be hard work, especially for those that want to go on to grad school. And I think it inspires them. I think it also teaches them empathy. Some of them come at some of these soldiers with very little interest or empathy for Confederate soldiers because they are staunch Unionists, and they might find abhorrent to today's society, as most of us do, things that the Confederacy stood for and included, namely, slavery being number one. But sometimes I have forced some of those students into researching a Confederate soldier just to help them understand to do research isn't necessarily to cheer on and put that historical icon on a pedestal. You're trying to understand them in the context of their time, and that's so important. And I find that even those students have emerged at the end, realizing I still greatly disagree with, obviously, the cause that these guys fought for. I would not have made that decision myself if I were him, et cetera, et cetera. but I understand a whole lot better. This guy was a human. This guy had a human story, a family. I understand it. It's important to bring it to the light. And I think that they emerge on the other side, you know, the better for it, or at least I would hope so.
Mm-hmm. Well, someone beat me to the punch in the comments, Ashley, and they said students learn more when the teacher or professor has high standards. And I wanted to thank you for that, because you're pushing a lot of people to think deeply in the classroom, more so than some others may have. And I don't know, I'm not saying names, I'm just saying, you know, by doing that project, you're making people think deeper about it. And Cameron Sowers agrees in the comments, just so you know.
Oh, of course he does.
So his grade just went up next
year. He has to, because he was just notified that he will be a fellow for next year's CWI program. So he has to agree strongly at this point. So thank you, Cameron. We'll keep you on.
Yeah. He also, as soon as you put about Kill to Gettysburg, he posted a link as soon as you said that. So
see,
he's on it. Speaking of, you know, what's going on in the comment section and what we're doing.
Yeah, what do you got for us?
How do you think things like this, using technology, using that GIS, using, Steve, you're always on Facebook Live doing something or making a video or something else, and I'm trying to keep up with you, and it's tough. How do you think that opens doors to new dialogues for us to be able to do this, where it's not just about the battlefield, it's about bigger and broader topics?
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you guys, I think it comes naturally just being in DC because of kind of the range of what we have here. And so Ashley, I know you appreciate this because you're a former Ranger, and, you know, we spend so much time creating these programs and doing research and stuff, you know, so I'll have like a school group with me and I'll take them up to one of our forts that's actually in really good condition, right? And I'll talk about the fort. I'll never forget this. This one young boy was like, "Where's the fort?" And I pointed to it. It was like a pile of dirt. He's like, "That's all?" And it like broke my heart, you know. I was just like, man. You know, it's a part of the gig, right? But I think I remember talking to Ashley about this, and then the other staff members at Richmond when I was training as an intern there, right? I think it was Mike Gorman and even Bert Dunkerley. Yep, I have to bring his name up. And so I think one of the things I brought up, it's really important to have your own particular style as a historian, but also there has to be substance there, right? And so, and I spoke about this with a historical organization a couple of weeks ago. It's like, yeah, with this pandemic and stuff, this is an opportunity for historical organizations to, in many ways, get their message out in a kind of a different apparatus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just don't throw out videos just to throw out videos, right? I mean, really put out good information out there, stuff where people were like, hey, that's pretty good, I want kind of more, right? So I am in no way a technology expert here, right? I'm just simply going out there using my tripod. You'll appreciate this, John, to like kind of pan around. I'll add some music, and then we talk about piles of dirt, right? And we try to make it really interesting, right? But it's simply, it just provides more substance, right? So when you come back out here and you visit this earthwork, we can talk about the people that built them. We can talk about the people that lived in the neighborhood, lived around the forts, or that were affected by the fortifications. We can talk about the next 50 or so years of these sites being around and kind of what happens next, right? So I think this is just an opportunity for all of us to create this dialogue and really take advantage of it, right? I think, John, that's the reason why we get along so well. I think everyone that's kind of out doing history, whether it's you, Civil War, Pittsburgh, my buddy Rich Condon, Pennsylvania in the Civil War. There's so many great historians out there just doing it for the love of history, right? I see no rivalry there. And we mutually support each other. I think it should be like that throughout. And you'll be surprised about who will come out and who will keep on supporting us. What do you think about that, Ashley?
Yeah, I would say, if there is a silver lining to come out of the current COVID-19 crisis, I think definitely you could point to a greater appreciation for the role that technology can play, of course, in so many different categories, from telehealth right on down to, saving people's lives, down to the kind of stuff that we do. But I think we are finding more creative ways to engage a broader audience, to keep people engaged during this time. I think, higher educators as a whole, they're doing their Zoom classes online. And, there's never going to be an exact substitute that's going to be the same as being there, being on site, on the ground for yourself, or, having that back and forth with your students in the classroom, without a screen separating you. However, that being said, I think we have to accept and embrace the fact that technology is making possible a lot of new things for us. It's making new connections. It's expanding our communities and our reach and our audience. People like it. We were scared when we had to cancel the CWI conference this June that, we would lose some of our base, right away. They couldn't come to Gettysburg for, their beloved conference. Some of them were coming for over 35 years. But what we found is they're tuning in, to these live streams. They're finding a way to get on, and they're embracing Zoom and Facebook and all kinds of things because they're hungry for the content. They want to be there, and they're sharing it with friends at home, who perhaps never were interested in coming to the conference or going to a battlefield. They might look over their shoulder one night and see what's going on. They say, that's kind of interesting.
Right.
And so it does provide new opportunities that, hopefully we can walk away from this and say, yes, when things get back to, normal as we can be, we don't have to necessarily replace one with the other, but we can certainly work hand in hand. And I think there are so many sites and so many institutions that are doing a wonderful job of it right now.
And John, you're doing an incredible job of illuminating that. I mean, so
Sure.
For the visitors that are watching, the viewers, we were just kind of chatting before we went live, and I'm just like, hey, John, how's your week going? He's like, this is my 6th live video this week. That's a lot, okay? Because there's so much content here, right? And I mean, so you're connecting different institutions, organizations, right? Different parks, different historians. And just an example of that, so like, if you're interested in the Civil War Defenses of Washington, which is a National Park Service organization, right, program, you can come, and you featured these people before as well, different organizations, John. We're talking about Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Home, our buddy Jake Wynn that's working there. We've got President Lincoln's Cottage, and I've been working with them for the past 3 years. Think about all these different organizations that we're exposing to the wider public here, right? And we do this internally as organizations, right? And we kind of want the public to see that as well. So you can kind of, mesh this, so you come to DC to kind of do a Civil War Washington trip. Oh my gosh, not only are you visiting several national parks, the National Mall, Rock Creek Park, Civil War Defenses of Washington, National Capital Parks East with like the Frederick Douglass House and the Civil War forts, but you're doing visiting all these other organizations and supporting them as well, right? John, I know Ashley and I feel this. We commend you for what you're doing. This has been spectacular.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm slightly embarrassed now.
That's what I'm here to do. So
I am. I'm thank you so much for that. That was one of the things that I guess I was ready for, being stuck inside. I was like, oh, I'm already here doing this. I might as well turn the camera on more often and do this. But I've always wanted to give back to other historians and other historical organizations. It was never about me thumping my chest and saying, this is how much I know. That's why I love having evenings like this, where we can get together and share our experiences and our thoughts and try to have more dialogue come out of it. And believe me, the comment section, there's a lot of comments to go through over the next day or so.
Sure. I'll help you out with that. Is there any other questions that people are asking there, John?
Oh yeah, there was one question, I think it was directed towards Ashley, and it was about the fallen at Gettysburg, or killed at Gettysburg. And someone was wondering, I don't know if I can find it or not. Someone was wondering if any of the students had ever, there it is, do they ever discover family history where family might have fought or experienced the battle at Gettysburg? Have you ever had a student who's like, well, I had family here, so I'd like to run with that idea?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So some of the students do have family who fought here. To this point, and I'm just trying to make sure that I don't misspeak here. To this point, I don't think we've had a student actually research an ancestor, a family member of theirs However, one of the interesting things to come out of this project is that through the publishing of these soldier profiles, some interesting family connections have been made across the country. I think Hannibal Howell, who was with, I believe, 76th New York, I want to say, Jonathan Tracy, did a profile about him my first year that I was at the college. And he did that profile because one of our CWI attendees, that was their ancestor. And they said, hey, I have this name for you. I know he was killed here. I have a little bit of background info. Would you consider doing a profile? And so John did a really great profile. And in the course of his research, he found some descendants, one of whom I believe is a current South Carolina senator, I want to say, or congressman. He's a pretty high up politician, but anyway, so he finally was able to make this connection with Hannibal Howell. And then he in turn made a connection with the CWI attendee who gave us the information. They realized they're related. And then it came out of the woodwork a few months later that someone across the country, maybe Washington State or Oregon, said, well, I'm related to Hannibal Howell as well. And so all of a sudden, this family came together with very, very different current situations and backgrounds, but they're all linked, by this one distant ancestor. So that was pretty cool. And then most recently, one of our student fellows, she actually started with us her freshman year as a volunteer for the Killed at Gettysburg program, Erica Usack. She'll be on in the fellows program again next year. She was researching a soldier from Ohio, near where she is from. She's from Ohio, Lieutenant Elisha Hayden, who fought with the 8th Ohio at Gettysburg. And she just did an incredible job with this research. She was so thorough. She tracked down so many different records. And she even was able to connect with the direct descendant of Elisha Hayden, who met with her. They had coffee a few times in Ohio and shared this incredible treasure trove of letters and
Wow.
stories, not just, family history that, you kind of wonder, well, is there really a record here? But actual, concrete written records, photographs, family photographs of Hayden as well as his family, all different, just amazing stuff. And they have developed this friendship, this relationship. And she's going to, I think, speak to an SUV camp that he's part of, or a local Civil War roundtable that he's part of about her research. But they made this connection, and it was so special to this family. So the way that our students have been able to connect other people's families, either with other family members they didn't know about across the country, has been impressive and surprising. But then how they've been able to really make someone's own personal family history come to life, make sense, and get published, get out there for people to see in an entirely new light is just really amazing. And I sing Erica's praises all the time. I think she's just one of the greatest. So that has been one of the great joys of this job.
That's amazing, because it also showcases to a student that, being a historian is also partially being a public servant,
Sure.
Well
helping
said.
someone along the
Absolutely.
way.
Sure.
And we tend to forget about that. We're like, oh, you stay in an archive or you're on a park all day. Well, you're a public servant too. If you do it properly, you're a public servant. And that's very important. Steve, what are you looking forward to in the future as far as programming at your location that's not of the battlefield type? Anything coming up, or anything you're thinking about, or maybe even a video that you're going to be posting?
More videos coming, of course. I'll be headed off to Ohio within the next month or so to be working at my detail at Charles Young. But kind of getting back to kind of it's similar in ways to kind of the Killed at Gettysburg, but it was I've been working on this project for almost 2 years now. Okay. And it was set to be released in March. And as we know, that was not possible with the pandemic going on. But the project is called Faces of the Forts. The idea is to identify and kind of in many ways display and the people that served in and around the defenses of Washington, not only the soldiers, but also laborers, both white and black, women, the people that were just connected to the fort in some sort of way. So I've been working in detail with the website right now. So what we want is for visitors, or excuse me, the public to, if you have anyone connected to the defenses of Washington, you could share their image or their service record or a letter or something like that. We're not going to take the record. If you have a copy of that, and we're going to feature that on our website, the Faces of the Forts page, and we'll talk about that, right? So we've, my process so far is we've got the soldiers, we've got the officers, but we also have the laborers. And the next people I'm going to talk about is the women that were connected with Civil War Washington. My favorite being Kate Chase, the daughter of Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, who I'm completely just enthralled with. She's absolutely incredible. And then
people were.
Yes, yes, indeed. So, this is it's really kind of a public kind of partnership in many ways. And as you know, we have a lot of friends in the history field that I've already been in contact with, that are willing to offer up images of soldiers. So we'll have plenty of soldiers. I'm hoping that we can find more accounts of civilians that served in the defenses of Washington. There was a large influx or a population of civilian laborers, both white and, came from different parts of the world, actually. And then obviously formerly enslaved people that served in the defenses as well. So there's a lot here that we want to do. And once we start opening back up, that project will be released, and it's ongoing as well. So the more people that come into, that are involved, the more images we'll add, the more stories we'll add. I've already received service records, pension records, right? And we're simply just going to scan them. We'll transcribe them for the visitors, and we'll put them right on the CWDW website. So, and then we'll start doing programs with it as well. Can you imagine going out to these sites, pulling up a photo and be like, this gentleman was here, or this woman was here 159 years ago? Like, that's incredible, right? So that's what we're working with, and look forward to sharing that with the public.
Yeah, please pass that link on to me, and I would love to put it up on the Tattoo Historian page.
Will do.
Fantastic. Ashley, how about you? What are you looking forward to in the future? Any kind of project you're working on or anything like that?
Yeah. So for the college, for the Civil War Institute and Civil War Era Studies, the two have recently merged. We are actually looking to do more digital content, digital programming, regardless of what the circumstances of the pandemic might or might not be. We realize that there is a strong place and demand for this kind of content. We want to expand our reach to help us become more of a resource for people who might not be able to get to Gettysburg, but want some interpretive videos, who might want some interviews, either student-led or co-facilitated by myself and a student, with historians about recent scholarship, interviews with local battlefield guides out on the battlefield about, particular aspects of the battle or the commemorative landscape we want to add to our kind of digital archive. So that's definitely on the horizon. Definitely looking forward to welcoming the next class of first-year students to Gettysburg and trying to convert them to the dark side of Civil War history. If they haven't been converted already, doing some. That's right. Doing some more in-field interpretation and interpretive workshops with them about how to run a successful interpretive tour, kind of give them access to some of our local historians, museum practitioners, curators, things like that, so they can understand more fully the profession of public history, not just frontline interpretation, but preservation and curatorial work as well. Continue the Killed at Gettysburg project, of course. So those are big on the list. For myself personally,
dissertation. Publish that dissertation, Ashley. We've been waiting.
That is
that's the real question everyone's asking, okay?
Yes.
That is personally on the list for me, is getting back finally to the manuscript that has been sitting since late 2014, 2015, when I had to drop it like a hot potato amidst the Civil War sesquicentennial events in Richmond. And it seemed like every time I tried to come back to it, there would be a job change, a move, a child born, another move, another child born. So now another perhaps silver lining of COVID-19 is a temporary furlough from CWI due to financial constraints on the college. And I'm going to use some of that time in the coming months hopefully, to devote to the manuscript and try and get it sent off to a publisher and get their response to it. It's been something that's been long in wait, and my my elite ladies of Confederate Richmond have been waiting long enough for their story to be told. So I can't wait to get back to revising that and hopefully getting that out the door within a few years or so.
That's awesome. I've been approached by the director of CWI, whose name I will not say anymore.
Nope, don't say it.
He'll Zoom bomb us, and he'll end up being on here. He said, "Can you give me a list of all the hardware you use? I need to know what we need to have when you move."
That's a good idea.
I'm like, well, yeah, I'll even like screenshot you what all my hardware that I use for whatever. But I'm like, I'll do it as long as I still have the open invite to come to the CWI conference every year and do live streams. Like, oh yeah, just send me the stuff. Like, okay.
Of course, yes.
But yeah, but that's nice to see others getting heavily involved. And I think that what we're going through now is going to influence the field in that way. You're going to see people who are shaking off the rust and like, hey, I can do this, and we can use this for this reason and in this manner to get our mission out or whatever it may be. And people are going to get good at it. And it's going to be really nice to see it grow and flourish and all that, because as Steve said earlier, I'm a piece of that puzzle with Civil War Pittsburgh, with Steve down there at Civil War Defenses and everyone else who's doing this digitally. But it's not like there's only a little bit of pie left and you have to fight over it. We all can make this work together, and I'm really happy to see that coming. And as I myself personally, I'm looking forward to working with students at Western University as a TA and helping them out and try to figure out their digital footprint and work with other people at Western in London, Ontario. And
yeah, you have a whole a digital program set up that you're gonna, or a digital project, right? That you're gonna try to be enhancing or working on when you're out there.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be taking the tattooed historian thing, and I'm going to be branching that out into new history, Canadian history, which is, kind of like, I haven't found someone who does this in the area I'm going to, so I'm going to try to monopolize it and just be like, okay, this is my sector.
You want all of the pie.
Yeah, I'll take it all. Especially if it's like pumpkin, I'll eat it all. But yeah, it's been fun to try to think of it as a transnational thought. Okay, I'm always going to have that terabyte of American information, but then I also want to do the Canadian information and such. And so it's going to be a subtle change in that way, where we're still going to be talking history, but it's going to be newer history for a lot of people who are following or in the comment section. I'm really excited about that.
Well, John, I was going to say, I'm particularly interested to see what kind of Civil War history, because I think on the peripheral, we hear a lot about Civil War history in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. Especially with, African Americans fleeing to Canada to seek their freedom, right?
Yes.
During the war, if I recall, there were members of the 54th Massachusetts that came from Canada, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I'm really interested to kind of see, and I know there was a Confederate presence in Canada as well. So I'm particularly interested to kind of see what you do with that. So
Montreal had a big Confederate presence in there, a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Montreal. But lower Canada and upper Canada, it's either way, had a lot of African Americans or African Canadians who came south and fought because their grandfathers or grandmothers escaped slavery and went to Canada,
right,
for their freedom. So they have that connection and they come back. And I'm really looking forward to that, even though my dissertation is going to be the First World War, with Americans going to Canada to fight in the First World War. It's that story of what was the border like throughout history and transnational history and stuff like that. And I would like to take it and run with it in more eras than one, and just figure it out. But I did find, you'll appreciate this, Steve, I did find a museum to cheese. So we're going to go to the Museum of Cheese, and we're going to hang out. We're going to do a live stream tour, hopefully, the Museum of Cheese.
I ate a ton of food when I went to Montreal. It's gonna be
so Gouda. You don't even.
It's gonna be so Gouda. I like it.
But yeah,
was it more than your 6 or 8 plate record, or were we talking double digits in terms of plates?
It was epic. I mean, the food and the booze at the same time. It was, and it was also the hospitality of the the Canadian people as well. Just, I mean, if I was there for more than 5 days, I don't think I would have made it back to the U.S. So,
So you got a 5-day limit on my couch, and
that's right. That's right.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to doing all that, and I know that you guys, both of you, are looking forward to having a larger digital footprint in the future. Steve has one that's my size, if not slightly bigger, and I'm just branching out on multiple platforms. You guys are doing a lot, and I usually see Civil War Defense of Washington just posted a video, and I'm like, dang, I got to post a video.
Yeah.
Feed off of each other, or like, hey.
It is pretty impressive, and the fact that you're getting around the outskirts of DC, you know, you're in the northern half for, you know, part of the morning, and then all of a sudden you're in the southern half, and it's like, you know, you're everywhere around DC in between posting videos. It's cool.
Well, it's fun because we work with 3 national parks to manage these Civil War sites, right? And then there's also the National Mall, and they've got a ton of Civil War sites, right? Mm-hmm. So it's man, it's just as I said, it's kind of a blank canvas, right? I mean, yeah. I love piles of dirt. I really love earthworks, you know, but it's really the stories that that built the earthworks and that were around the earthworks for generations that I'm particularly interested. So it's not only a blank canvas, I feel like it's everlasting in many ways, right? There's so many different opportunities here. And so I'm excited, you know, as always, you know, this is kind of what we do. I'll say real quickly, I know I see Ashley there, and my goodness, 2013 is when I first met Ashley when I was an intern at Richmond National Battlefield Park. I'm from Colorado, a lot of people know, very proud of that, of course. I went to the University of Northern Colorado, and my Civil War professor was Brian Luskey. So it's a small world, the Civil War world is, but I remember it was our first day of training, Ashley, and I think you recall this as well. So John, we get like the itinerary for the day, right?
Right.
And it's a Monday, and we meet the Rangers, and the first major Ranger we meet is Ashley Luskey. I saw the last name, I was like, Luskey? And almost immediately we just kind of hit it off. So it's been a wonderful journey, wonderful friendship. So I'm very happy to be with you here tonight, Ashley.
Well, it is kind of amazing how there are, I think, maybe 3 to even maybe 2 degrees of separation ever in the Civil War world. I mean,
right.
Obviously, the fact that Brian was your professor at Northern Colorado is pretty amazing. And then you come to Richmond. But then I think you and I found out also, we both did the Gettysburg semester in different years. And we actually lived in the same room in the Civil War house.
That's right.
That semester, right. In bedroom. So it is kind of funny how these lines are constantly overlapping, but it's a good thing.
That's awesome. And that's something that I want to point out too to everyone that's following is the importance of networking to get this all done. It's very, very important, whether it's with a visitor, a student and a professor, or whomever it may be. All this wouldn't be possible if we didn't work together and have communication and start talking to one another. And as we said, we're going through a tough time, but this allows us to have even better communication. We should be networking. If we can't network now, we're never going to be able to network. Exactly right. You know, this is the time to perfect that and get that done. But I want to thank both of you for being on. I've taken more of your time than I said I would.
We had fun tonight.
It's getting past my bedtime. But I appreciate both of you coming on, especially you, Dr. Luskey, for putting up with having Fan of Fantasia next to your name the entire time.
Where's HJ?
I've always been one of his greatest fans. She did try to break into the room that I'm in at the very beginning of our call, and she was called back downstairs. So I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been a knockdown, drag out fight that you all can hear in the background so far, but she sends her love. I think she heard your voice and thought you were up here. That's why she came.
She's my favorite. I appreciate everything you're doing, John. I look forward to seeing you where you take this. I can't wait to see what you do in Canada as well. And I can't wait to come up to Canada and hang out with you. So here we go.
Yeah, I got the poutine places picked out, and I have all the restaurants. We're ready to go, buddy.
All right, buddy.
Just don't keep him there for more than 5 days, or else we'll never see him again.
That's right.
No, I'm going to warn the border guards. Don't let him in more than 5 days. You know.
So John, I'll start. I saw some specific questions in there, and I'll go in there to help you answer them as well. Okay.
I appreciate that. I'm gonna go through them over the next day or so, and everyone watching, we'll go through over the next 24 hours or so. We'll get as many of them answered as possible, and comments and all that stuff. We don't ignore comments or questions. It just takes us maybe a little while to get back to you, because interaction with you guys in the chat and everything is very, very important. You're not just followers, but you're also along for the ride here, and we want to make sure that you are part of the process and part of the networking that's going on. Because I've seen people on here already that are handing out their own emails about, I would like to have that digital copy of this, and people are putting emails in the comments. So there's networking going on in the comments, which is fantastic. That's pretty meta. So
yeah, that's great. Wonderful.
But thank you again, Dr. Luskey and Steve.
Thank you guys. Thank you, John. Thank you, Steve, for the invite. Thank you, General. It was good to see you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's.
He's always with me, Ashley. You know this.
I do.
That's right. That's right.
Well, we wish everyone well. If they're interested, they can follow us on Facebook, Civil War Defenses of Washington, or our website, www.mps.gov/CWDW, or Instagram page, Civil War Defenses of Washington. Because we everywhere. We're not messing around. We're omnipresent, and we hope you follow us. Plenty of videos and really cool posts and things like that. So join us for the ride.
You would kill on TikTok. I'm just saying.
No, I would never support TikTok. No, I've had a few younger Rangers suggest TikTok. At the moment, I'm unwilling to adopt TikTok, but we'll see what happens. Okay.
Yeah, we got to get that done. So yes, we'll work on that. We'll have you dancing by the end of the year. Someone asked in the comments earlier if you dance, so might have a
the sun's got to be down. Okay.
Got a willing audience.
Yeah, it's some audience on the Tattooed Historian page, buddy.
I know that.
Thank you again, you two. I really appreciate you, and it's great to see
you guys.
Been too long.
Great to see you too. Stay well.
Indeed. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.